Okay, welcome everybody. We are going to review for our test that's this coming Thursday. One part of the test that we did before Rosh Hashana that for some reason everybody asked to get a little bit of review for. So here we go. I have in front of you the Gemara that you should have from that handout. This is just the lines that we need that I pulled out to make it simpler to focus. The Gemara says, Amar of Kars B'dayim Rabbi Yochanan. שלוש ספרים נפתחים בראש השנה, אחד של רשם גמורים, ואחד של צדיקים גמורים, ואחד של בינונים. Right, there are three books open before HaKadosh Baruch Hu on Rosh Hashanah. What are those? One of the Rishayim, one of the Tzadikim, and one of the Beinonim. Right, the assumption here being that we have a Beinoni, and therefore a Beinoni is someone who's about 50-50, a Rasha is someone 51% or more bad, a Tzadik is someone 51% or more good. The Gemara says what happens already again on Rosh Hashanah specifically. Tzadikim gemurim nechtav v'nechtam la'alter l'chaim. So the tzadikim are nechtav and nechtam both for chaim, la'alter for immediate life. Rishayim gemurim nechtam v'nechtam la'alter l'misa. And the Rishayim are written immediately and sealed for death. Right? Apparently, the Rasha is such a big Rasha that he doesn't even get a Sarasimei Tshuva to change. Right, on Rosh Hashanah, he's written and sealed, signed, sealed, delivered. And the tzaddik also, he's so good that he doesn't need the Aser Simei Tshuva anymore. He's already written and sealed for life. What about the Beinoni, the average middle-of-the-road guy? Teluyin va'omdim Rosh Hashanah vad Yom Kippurim. So the normal translation of this is that Hashem kind of suspends judgment, totally suspends the judgment, doesn't judge them on Rosh Hashanah fully. Rather, he gives them Rosh Hashanah till Yom Kippur, Aser Simei Tshuva, and then Zachu Nechtavin L'chaim. If they merit it, they'll be written L'chaim, Lo Zachu Nechtavin L'misa. And if they don't merit it, then they will be written for Misa. So we discussed a few questions here. The main question we talked about is, according to this, someone who's generally a tzaddik, 51% or more is good, should be written for life. And we don't see that in our world, unfortunately. Sometimes there are good people who die. And then on the opposite end also we see people who are not so good and they end up living another year. Again, we're not now focused on asking the question of just in general understanding the topic of tzaddik v'ralo, why that might be, but just we want to know what the Gemara is trying to tell us. What does it mean? The Gemara says if you're good you live, if you're bad you die, and that we don't see that, right? Clearly the Gemara is MS, the Gemara has to be right. So clearly the Gemara is trying to teach us something slightly different. So very quickly we reviewed in class four different answers we reviewed. Two were redefining life and death, Chaim and Misa, and two were redefining what a tzaddik and a rasha means. Starting over here on the left, redefining life and death. It doesn't mean in this world, it means in Olam Haba. And therefore, our judgment, our question falls away. We were wondering, how could it be? We see people live, die. No, we're not talking about life and death in this world. We're talking about Olam Haba, that every year, a person's share in Olam Haba is reassessed by Hashem. Or, as we saw from the Raavad, the idea of the predetermined lifespan that Hashem gives to every person based on only cheshbonos that he knows. On Rosh Hashanah, that is measured again and evaluated to see if it should be increased or decreased. But again, we don't know those cheshbonos. So it could be a good person who died this year at the age of 60, and we wonder why didn't he live till 90? It could be he was supposed to die when he was 40. But because he was a tzaddik, he lived his life in the right way. So he got extra years tacked onto his life, and vice versa. Even though we see a Rasha die at 80, and we say, why should he live so long? No, maybe he was supposed to live to 100, and this was a punishment that he died at 80. Or the other two answers, redefining tzaddik and rasha, it means 100% a tzaddik, 100% a rasha, which is a little bit meduyak in the words, where it says gemurin, tzaddikim gemurin, right, and risham gemurin. In other words, what the Gemara is teaching us is that if you're perfect, a perfect tzaddik, if such a thing exists, you're written and sealed for chaim. If you're unfortunately a perfect rasha, you're written and sealed for death, for Misa, right? And then everybody else, which probably is most people in the world, according to this, are the Beinonim, and then the message of the Gemara is that we have to take a Simei Tshuva, very seriously. And the last answer, which is just a bit technical, which I'm not even positive if we did in both classes, is very simply, the Gemara here is not defining a tzaddik to mean a righteous person or a rasha to mean a evil person. It means a tzaddik is someone who was zocha b'din. They did merit another year in Hashem's eyes to live another year. For whatever reason, Hashem decided that. They did something that Hashem decided. So they could be an evil person, but they're going to live another year. For the purposes of this Gemara, they're called a tzaddik. They may not be, in fact, a real righteous person, but in terms of this judgment, they are called a tzaddik. And even if you have a good person who dies, right, who really is a tzaddik, but in terms of our Gemara, he's called a rasha only in terms of that he is not zocha b'din. For whatever reason, Hashem chose that he's not going to continue living past this year. That was the first question. Then we read the Rambam, which I didn't bring the whole quote in front of you, but the Rambam, who we know typically quotes things in the exact way the Gemara does, instead of having these words zachu nichtavan l'chaim, lo zachu nichtavan l'misa, he says that im asu tshuva nechtav l'chaim, im lo asu tshuva then nechtav l'misa. And we asked the question, two questions. Number one, why does he change from the language of the Gemara? And number two, why is it true, in fact, that you have to do tshuva? If a person is a Beinani, he's 50-50, during a Sarasimi tshuva, let him give a little tzedakah, right? And now he'll be 51% who's good, Gvaldik, he should be written l'chaim. So again, number one, why does he change from the language of the Gemara? Number two, why is it even true that he has to do tshuva? So for that, we discussed a couple of things, and we saw one answer was that not doing tshuva during a Sarasimi tshuva is a bigger avera than any other mitzvah that he could possibly do during a Sarasimi tshuva. Hashem, even though we could do tshuva all year round, during a Sarasimi tshuva, Hashem is begging us to do tshuva, and if we don't do it, it's a bigger avera. That was one answer. Another answer we had from the Sichos Musa from Shmuel Chaim Shulevitz. I don't know if I mentioned that name, but that's what we talked about. Tuluyim v'undim Rosh Hashana and Yom Kippur. What does that mean? It doesn't really mean, like we said, Hashem pushes off judgment. No, Hashem is judging everybody Rosh Hashana. Totally from the language of talui to hang. It's a real judgment that a Beinani, this is a little scary, but it's what he says, that a Beinani, which again, according to what we learned, is probably all of us, is written on Rosh Hashana for Misa, right? We're totally, but it's not executed yet. We have a Sarasimi Tshuva to uproot that death sentence, right? Like, he compared it to someone who's about to be hung on a gallows with the rope around his neck, but the stool has not been kicked out yet from underneath. So that's where we are, Sarasimi Tshuva, but we have a Sarasimi Tshuva. So a couple mitzvahs won't uproot a death penalty, a death sentence. Only doing Tshuva, only changing who we really are, will do that. And finally, we saw from Rav Hutner the idea, a very beautiful idea, that we're not talking about numbers here, 51%, 50%. A tzaddik is someone who be'emes typically does what he's supposed to in the eyes of Hashem, and that's his normal natiyah, his normal way of thinking, his normal way of acting. But a rasha, unfortunately, is the opposite. A Beinani is someone who has no inner definition in his ruchnias. Sometimes he does this, sometimes he does that, doesn't really think about it too much, and therefore you cannot just uproot a death sentence, or even without that, you can't, be zocha to anything just by doing a few mitzvahs. That's not what Hashem is after. Hashem is after us changing our personality, our devotion, our whole mindset to our service of Hashem. And therefore, a Beinani who's in the middle of nowhere needs some definition, and the only way to do that is to do tshuva properly. So that is a quick review of the topic of the Gimel Sfarim that are open before Hashem on Rosh Hashana. If there are any other questions, feel free to email me.